Hi, this is Joan. Before we begin, I want to give you a heads up that this episode contains discussion of suicide. In the beginning, there were the Bash brothers, Mark McGwire and Jose Canseco. Back in the 80s, they flexed in front of mirrors in the Oakland clubhouse and were baseball's favorite buddy comedy. But over the years, through home runs and injuries and too many secrets, their relationship frayed. They retired. And on a Thursday morning in 2005, they met again on Capitol Hill.
You'd rise with me and raise your right hands.
A group of stern-faced representatives took their places on an elevated dais in the Rayburn building for a public session of the House Oversight Committee. This was the same committee that had recently held hearings on the September 11th attacks and weapons of mass destruction. And now it was turning its attention to baseball.
The primary goal in this inquiry is to break the vicious cycle of growing steroid use that begins at the professional level and inevitably, it seems, trickles down to college and high school sports.
Photographers ran here and there, pointing their lenses at 5 of baseball's biggest stars, who looked tired and twitchy in ill-fitting suits. Some were graying. Some had reading glasses perched on their noses. All of them looked as if they'd do anything to be anywhere else.
This was electric.
That's former Representative Tom Davis, a Republican from Virginia who presided over these hearings.
For the first time I can remember, every member of the committee was sitting there in their seat ready to ask their question.
This was a spotlight Major League Baseball definitely did not want. Commissioner Bud Selig was there, albeit begrudgingly. So was the executive director of MLB's Players Union and several other top league executives who'd all been subpoenaed by Congress. And then, of course, there were the players. McGwire, Canseco, Sammy Sosa, Rafael Palmeiro, and Curt Schilling. Only one of them had admitted to taking steroids, but they were all about to be grilled by lawmakers who seemed to be driven as much by reason as by their love of the game.
When Mr. McGwire and Mr. Sosa took us on that ride that summer, that wasn't just hitting home runs. That was a country hanging on to heroes.
I come from a family of huge baseball fans, and I'm not sure you have understood the intensity of the feeling of these people.
Mr. McGwire, a stretch of Interstate 70 that runs through the heart of my district is named after you. So naturally, I'm very concerned.
I am sick and tired of having you tell us that you don't want to be considered role models.
That last voice is the angry father of a high school baseball player who'd used steroids. He told his son's story, and at one point, he turned and faced the stars.
If you haven't figured it out yet, let me break the news to you that whether you like it or not, you are role models.
This day marked a turning point. It forced us to look at baseball in a different light, made us realize, without a doubt, that we'd been tricked. But how did we go from the home run race, from Selig handing McGwire a shiny trophy in center field, to the abject discomfort of this day, when 2 American institutions collided, baseball and the government? It was one system bending another to its will. These hearings changed the way we feel about the men who were once our heroes, and America's pastime. They got some things right, and a few very important things wrong. The steroid era took its dying breaths that day. Does it matter how we killed it? I'm Joan Neeson, and this is Crushed. Odoo is a suite of business apps, but what does that really mean? You're on your computer, maybe in your PJs, maybe not. You have a tab open with a dashboard of applications, one for every department in your company. There's manufacturing, accounting, website, purchase, and more. You click on the CRM app and reach out to new opportunities. Then you click on the inventory app to make sure your stock levels are good before clicking on the sales app to send a quote to a customer. How many tabs do you have open? Just one. Odoo makes things simple. Go to odoo.com/sports to start a free trial. That's odoo.com/sports. I have a question for you. How are you feeling these days? Maybe a little bummed or a bit off? I get it, and it could be a sign you should talk to somebody. Crushed is supported by BetterHelp, offering professional therapy done securely online. Fill out a questionnaire to help BetterHelp assess your needs and match you with your licensed therapist in under 48 hours. And schedule weekly video, phone, or live chat appointments. It's more convenient and more affordable than in-person therapy. Listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/crushed. That's betterhelp.com/crushed.
In my basement, I've got Joe DiMaggio's signed ball, I've got Ted Williams, I've got Mickey Mantle, Whitey Ford, Don Larson, Hank Aaron, you name it. I've got a bunch of bats that are autographed.
That's Representative Tom Davis again. He's the man who called these hearings.
What can I say? It's my favorite sport.
Davis has had Washington Nationals season tickets since the team played at RFK Stadium. And when it got a new ballpark, Davis used his political clout to make things a bit easier for fellow fans.
Fortunately, I was chairman of the committee with jurisdiction over D.C., and we were able to get a metro stop by the park.
So when a scandalous new baseball book hit shelves in February of 2005, Davis was intrigued.
Jose Canseco, variously called the bad boy of baseball or the godfather of steroids, has written a much-talked-about book he calls Juiced.
More than 4 years after he took his final major league at-bat, Jose Canseco was the biggest story in baseball. His book was an immediate bestseller.
You say this: I would never have been a major league caliber player without steroids, right?
Oh, well, it is a true statement. No ifs and buts about it.
3 years earlier, Ken Caminiti had become the first player to speak out publicly about his own use. But Canseco named names, including his Bash brother, Mark McGwire.
And he was a user, if you will.
Absolutely.
With you.
Yes.
Tell me about your first-hand experiences with McGwire steroids.
Just the first time injecting him in his buttocks. It wasn't like you gave a lot of thought. It was something so common.
MLB was allowing its employees to break the law and making money off of it. Davis wondered, could government intervention help clean up the game? So he reached out to Canseco and invited him to dinner at a swanky steakhouse in D.C.
Oh, you kidding? We went to the Palm. I had a huge steak. It was great. For once, I was able to eat on the committee. Congressional salaries, no big deal. In the Washington area, we were living hand to mouth. But I went to dinner with a couple of my staffers, and we had a series of questions. And that was worth 7 terms in Congress, just to have dinner with Jose and listen to his stories.
Of course, Davis was a little in awe. This guy had been one of the best players in baseball for nearly a decade, though many people suspected he was juicing. But that hardly seemed to matter to fans or the men writing checks. In 1990, he signed a contract that made him MLB's highest paid player. Here he is on a talk show around the time his book was released.
They allowed steroids in the game. They endorsed it. They turned their blind eye to it, and because they were all benefiting from it financially.
He said, they're spending millions of dollars on us. If you put that kind of money behind a player, particularly in a multi-year contract, don't you think you're going to know everything about them? And I asked him, will you go under oath on this? And he said, yes. And so that convinced us to go ahead.
Davis was especially curious about McGwire, who denied basically everything written about him in Juiced.
In a statement to 60 Minutes, McGwire said, quote, "Once and for all, I did not use steroids nor any illegal substance. The relationship that these allegations portray could not be further from the truth."
By 2005, the Sluggers were foils. One an outcast, the other still somehow a hero. One talking, burning bridges, the other silently holding on for dear life. McGwire wouldn't even lend his own voice to the denial. He'd faded from view since retiring in 2001. And in his absence, fans had begun to quietly question the home run race, his massive physique. They remembered the Andros story and saw it for what it really was. And Davis began to wonder, could he make McGwire the centerpiece of his hearings? Would the Slugger confess?
I remember Jose Canseco telling me, Mark's not going to lie to you. Mark is a decent, honest, religious person who's not going to lie to you.
Now, McGwire may well have been decent, honest, and religious, But none of that stopped him from refusing, along with the rest of Major League Baseball, to show up on Capitol Hill and answer questions. And at first, Congress had just wanted to start a conversation with the league about its steroid policy. Davis reached out and was rebuffed.
Major League Baseball basically gave us the finger. Had they come in and said, look, this is a real concern, we're trying to address this, that might have been different, but that's not what they did.
Baseball didn't want to talk, but Congress had the power to make it. It could just call an exploratory hearing, which happened all the time on Capitol Hill, when a congressional committee wants to hear testimony and learn about a particular topic. So that's what Davis's committee did. And even then, the league pushed back and said it wouldn't show up. MLB representatives spoke openly about how unnecessary this was, how Congress had no right to intervene, how their new drug policy was the gold standard. And when Congress asked for that drug policy, the league refused to hand it over. Meanwhile, the players were no more cooperative.
Rafael Palmeiro, when they said, are you going to go to the hearing, said, well, he said, it's my wife's birthday. I don't think I'm going to have time. I mean, when you hear those kind of comments, you say, well, I'm going to subpoena you.
Chairman Davis, you have subpoenaed 7 Major League Baseball players, present or former. How many are showing up?
We expect them all to show up.
All?
We expect them to. That's what the subpoena is. These people are not above the law. You know, they may fly on private planes and make millions of dollars and be on baseball cards, but a subpoena is exactly what it says it is. They have to appear.
That's what it took to get McGuire to cooperate. And the night before the hearings, he met with Davis in a private library in one of the House office buildings.
It was an emotional meeting. He was willing to tell the whole story.
The story was that he'd used anabolic steroids during his career. And even if some people had already started to assume he'd been juicing, this was big news. You see, McGuire was still a towering figure, still beloved for his record, no matter how short-lived it had been. If he were to admit publicly to using steroids, it would change the conversation. But McGuire had reservations.
He said, I don't mind telling the story. He said, but I've got a wife and a young son. I don't want to risk financially having to go through the legal hassle.
At the time, the feds were in the middle of several active investigations into steroid use in sports. One was Balco, and that's why Barry Bonds wasn't called to appear. Congress didn't want to interfere with an ongoing investigation.
He said, if I can get transactional immunity, I'm willing to go out and tell the whole story. So I called Alberto Gonzalez, who was the attorney general at the time, and said, look, I need you to tell me he can have transactional immunity, where he can say these things. It's going to blow this thing wide open. And Gonzalez says, well, I just can't.
Davis was frustrated because without immunity, McGuire would keep his story secret. And to prepare for the hearings, Davis coached him in the art of saying nothing so that he wouldn't be caught lying under oath.
He said, well, what am I supposed to say? I just said, I think all you need to say is, look, I'm not looking at the past, I'm looking at the future, and steroids are wrong. I said, we'll settle for that.
It's clear Davis really liked McGuire, wanted to help him, felt sorry for him even.
People make mistakes. We make bad choices sometimes. He capitalized on that, hitting home runs out of the park. But I can tell you this, he didn't lie, he didn't shortchange it, he fessed up to it, whereas others were in denial.
That's where he loses me. McGuire may have fessed up to Davis, but he was preparing to say nothing to the rest of the world. He only wanted to tell the truth in an environment without consequences, which invalidates his contrition in my book. When he told me this story, I heard a real tension between Tom Davis the fan and Tom Davis the congressman. He was thrilled to get the chance to spend time with a superstar, and who wouldn't be? This feels like what might have happened if 10-year-old me had interviewed McGuire. I'd have wanted an apology or even an excuse for why he did what he did. I would have been fine if the rest of the world were left in the dark. And that's what happened. Davis learned the truth, but it would be years before anyone else did. That's not how confessions are supposed to work, or public forums. And Davis's committee got a lot of criticism for spending time on this, even from other members of Congress. Remember, at this point, we were 2 years into the war in Iraq, 4 years into Afghanistan. Holding a hearing about making the world a fairer place, making sports a truly pure competition, wasn't going to land.
2005 was such a pressure cooker.
That's Dave Zirin, the sports editor at The Nation.
The floor really was pulled away from George W. Bush, and he went from being this, great leader who had like 80% popularity after 9/11 to popularity in the 20s. And yet somehow there's time to talk about steroids. It felt like a big, as we used to say, weapon of mass distraction. Like, this is a ridiculous use of time by Congress.
Zirin wasn't alone in his criticism of the impending hearings. Davis and his committee were derided in newspapers across America by columnists with different versions of that same argument. Really? You're going to spend your time on baseball? Mind you, most of these writers weren't cheerleaders for steroids. They wanted the game cleaned up. They just thought the government had better things to do than intervene. But Davis wasn't going to let bad press sway him. He was determined to save baseball. In the days and weeks leading up to March 17th, Tom Davis was busy. To make this hearing a success, he had to put on a show, to tell a story that would justify spending time and energy on baseball.
As we started taking a look at doing a hearing, we wanted to make sure that there was a legislative purpose, if you will, to the hearing, but we wanted to tell a story.
Davis argued that this was about more than just the fact that athletes were breaking the law when they took anabolic steroids. Remember, these things had been illegal since 1990.
And it was being emulated and carried down to the level of grade school in some cases. It was shocking how deeply this had penetrated and this had become almost normal behavior.
That was the story Davis was hearing, and the one he used to sell his plan to colleagues and the public. That kids were emulating Major League Baseball players and using anabolic steroids, which amounted to a public health crisis. But did it? The story that was told at the hearings was rooted in myth and propped up by anecdotal evidence, not science, which is true of a lot of the conversation about health and anabolic steroids. So first, let's break that down. We'll get to the kids in a minute. I've told you in past episodes about some real medical downsides to anabolic steroids, about Dan Nolte's freaky injuries, torn tendons, and a rib removal, about Jeremy Cummings' shrunken testicles. Lots of steroid users also develop acne. Men can end up with larger breasts and lower sperm counts. Good cholesterol numbers can drop and bad cholesterol can increase. These are real concerns. But in the short term, they're reversible.
The claims about the serious adverse effects of steroids are, for the most part, made up.
That's Dr. Norm Faust, the bioethicist from episode 4.
If you just Google harmful effects of steroids, you'll find literally thousands of articles that say they cause cancer, heart disease, and stroke. In none of these articles was there a single reference to a single article or a single quote from a single physician or scientist.
Now, you know I've done a lot of sticking up for the media in this show, but I'm not going to do that here. Over the years, journalists have parroted claims about serious, even deadly side effects, with minimal medical corroboration. Take the case of Lyle Alzado, a retired NFL linebacker who died of brain cancer in 1992.
He was an all-pro defensive end with an aggressive style he admitted was enhanced with steroids. And he believed those steroids cost him his life.
And this sloppy reporting really ticks Faust off. He's a pediatrician and has a master's degree in public health, and he can't stand that no one ever gets the facts right.
Lyle Alzado continues to be the poster boy for steroids and cancer, and there's zero evidence of it. The amount of drug that actually gets to your liver or any other organ is nanogram amounts, and as a result, they don't cause cancer. There's no known association.
The real problem with steroids, Faust says, is improper dosing. Lots of athletes just wing it and rely on advice from a friend or a dealer, not a doctor. And they often get their stuff on the black market without knowing for sure what they're taking. So Faust isn't saying steroids don't have downsides. He just wants to make it very clear that they're not lethal.
Can you name a single athlete in any sport who's had a heart attack while he or she was using steroids? Can you name a single baseball player or athlete in any sport who's had a stroke?
I cannot.
No, you won't, because there aren't any.
I interviewed another doctor, Charles Yasalis, who's an outspoken critic of steroids in sports. But even he agrees with Faust on the science.
They are not a major killer drug. They're not cocaine, heroin, amphetamines. I've never lost sleep about adults using these drugs. My passion against the drugs were always kids using them.
Both men are adamant that kids should not use steroids, or any other drugs for that matter. Here's Fost.
The side effects for children are very different. They can stunt your growth. Obviously, whatever serious adverse effects there are, children can't meaningfully consent to using them. So I think it is a problem.
Now, we don't know a ton about what steroids do to kids, because it would be totally unethical to run a study. But more generally, we do know it's really dangerous to mess with hormone levels in bodies that are still developing. And after Balco and Ken Caminity's confession, as we accepted that these drugs were all over baseball, people began to worry that players were setting a bad example, modeling to kids that steroids were the key to success. Even President George W. Bush expressed that fear in his 2004 State of the Union address, elevating the problem to a crisis.
The use of performance-enhancing drugs like steroids in baseball and other sports is dangerous, and it sends the wrong message. So tonight I call on team owners, union representatives, coaches, and players to get tough and to get rid of steroids now.
Davis saw himself as just continuing that mission. And as he and his committee crafted their argument against youth steroid use, they relied on statistics from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which runs a yearly survey.
Unfortunately, this is deep into our youth system. For example, 3.4% of 12th graders in the United States have used anabolic steroids. About 2% of 8th graders have used anabolic steroids.
That's Dr. Gary Wadler, a total anti-steroid crusader, in an interview on the morning of the hearings. But here's the thing. In 2004, the year of the study he quoted, youth steroid use actually was on a slight decline after a tiny spike. Things were trending in the right direction, and we had much bigger problems than steroids. About half of 8th graders reported alcohol use. Rates of teen meth use were nearly twice that of steroids. Same with hallucinogens and MDMA and nearly every other recreational drug.
Other drug use by children, teenagers, is far more threatening, far more potentially lethal than anabolic steroids with kids. Again, I hate kids using these drugs. I'm just trying to put it in perspective.
I was a kid then, a junior in high school, and my experience lines up with the numbers in that study. Nearly everyone I knew drank. I knew kids who were killed after driving drunk. And recreational drugs were everywhere. The opioid epidemic was picking up speed. So while Congress's intentions might have been good, it seems to me like its focus was kind of misplaced. But lawmakers soldiered on. And as they scripted the hearings, they told a story not just about kids abusing illegal steroids, but also about the psychological effects of these drugs. And they relied on a fair amount of misinformation. Here's Wadler.
You know, it can make you assertive, but frankly aggressive, called Roid Rage. And most tragically, for those who take it and go off it, a profound depression when you stop it, and it's resulted in suicides.
There's a lot to unpack in what he just said. First, Roid Rage. We've all heard that term before, but other doctors say it's actually a lot less common than you might think.
Whether it causes fits of rage, I've always questioned that. If it does, I think it's very rare.
That's Yasalis again.
If you give me Columbus, Ohio, and Ann Arbor, Michigan on a football Saturday, I will show you way more cases of alcohol-induced rage than you'll see in the United States of steroid-induced rage in 50 years.
Now, I want to dig into another thing Wadler said, and this is what Congress ran with.
It can result, for those who take it and go off it, a profound depression when you stop it, and it's resulted in suicides.
He's saying that withdrawal from steroids can lead to major depression, which can then cause suicide. And that's a tenuous link in medical literature. Some researchers think suicide is part of a larger web of risky behavior that some adolescents exhibit. Like a teenager who feels the desire or need to take steroids might also already be more prone to depression and suicidal thoughts, even without the drugs. And that web exists for adults, too. Steroid users are more likely to use other dangerous drugs, like Nolte. He abused alcohol and cocaine and amphetamines and experienced suicidal thoughts after he quit using them and quit anabolic steroids. So it's really tough to draw a straight line. But when Davis and his committee were planning their hearings, they made that line the centerpiece.
Kids were damaging their health, in some cases committing suicide and doing other things, a lot of unintended consequences from bulking up. This was well documented enough to know that for particularly young people, this wreaks havoc. This is not in question, in my opinion.
I asked Davis if he talked to doctors about this, and he didn't seem to remember. The suicide story moved him and sticks with him, and he found two families willing to tell it in front of his committee, the Garibaldis and the Hootens. Both had lost sons to suicide, sons who'd taken anabolic steroids to try to advance their baseball careers. Rob Garibaldi was a 24-year-old college player, clinging to a dream of being drafted when he died. And Taylor Hooten was just 17, a talented player on his high school team.
Without steroid use, Rob's suffering and ultimately his death would have been averted. There's no doubt in our minds that steroids killed our son.
I am absolutely convinced that Taylor's secret use of anabolic steroids played a significant role in causing the depression, the severe depression that resulted in his suicide.
Neither of these families agreed to speak with me, and I wished for their sake that there were a clear answer, something they could blame without a doubt for their tragic losses. But I spent a lot of time talking to doctors and reading medical literature, and unfortunately, it's just too big of a leap to blame steroids. And here's another thing. Rob Garibaldi was described as having suffered from depression and symptoms of bipolar disorder. Hooten was prescribed another drug that has a much clearer link to suicide than steroids, the antidepressant Lexapro. And the fact that Congress latched on to those stories is really frustrating, because it was almost onto something. While I was reporting this episode, I talked to a psychologist on background about all of this. He's studied and written about the lack of a link between youth suicide and steroids. And though he didn't want to be interviewed, I wanted to run what I'd learned by him. It turns out he has all kinds of problems with these hearings, even now, so many years later. And something he told me stuck with me. In its quest to take down steroids, to save baseball, Congress tried to apply science to a cultural problem, to the win-at-all-cost attitude that had permeated sports and society, tried to jam together two puzzle pieces that really didn't fit. But nothing, it seems, would get it to stop pushing, which is how baseball wound up on Capitol Hill, how Don Hooten wound up getting a chance to tell a generation of stars what he really thought about them.
I believe the poor example being set by professional athletes is a major catalyst, fueling the high usage of steroids amongst our kids. Our kids look up to these guys. Show our kids that you're man enough to face authority, tell the truth, and face the consequences.
This is that scene I described at the beginning of the episode. Hooten is pointing at the players, who look devastated. But was baseball's steroid problem really all on them? The league, its leadership, the men who let this all happen, they still hadn't answered a single question about their role. That's next. Stay with us.
DraftKings Sportsbook, America's top-rated sportsbook app, is putting you in the center of the action with endless ways to make it rain. From live betting to betting on your favorite players, they do it all. Check out the app every day this week to cash in on their daily odds boosts. And now, for a limited time, DraftKings Sportsbook is giving all new players a deposit bonus up to $1,000 when signing up using promo code CRUSHED. Must be 21 or older, New Jersey, Indiana, or Pennsylvania only. New customers only. Restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or in Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT.
Crushed is brought to you by Progressive, one of the country's leading providers of auto insurance. With Progressive's Name Your Price tool, you say what kind of coverage you're looking for and how much you want to pay, and Progressive will help you find options that fit within your budget. Use the Name Your Price tool and start an online quote today at Progressive.com. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Okay, let's get back to Capitol Hill. Back to the room full of uncomfortable players and an angry Bud Selig. The hearings began with Jim Bunning. He was a senator from Kentucky and a Hall of Fame pitcher. And he had some thoughts about players who use steroids.
Wipe all of their records out. Take them away. They don't deserve them.
Eventually, the conversation veered to public health. It was only 20 minutes, but it was charged. And as players became visibly emotional, it looked as if Davis's show was working, as if this story might actually compel someone to tell the truth. And then, after lunch, players paraded in for questioning.
After all, there's a cause and effect here. Steroid use becomes legitimized in large part because young people emulate star athletes.
Even though Canseco had just written a tell-all book, he claimed he couldn't speak freely because he was on probation. He'd been arrested after a nightclub brawl 4 years earlier, and then violated that probation by testing positive for anabolic steroids.
With immunity, I would be free to answer all questions posed by the committee. Without immunity, I cannot.
He did offer some general commentary about the league, though.
If Congress does nothing about this, Major League Baseball will not regulate themselves. Sure, the Players Association and the owners disagree on most things. But when it comes to making money, they're on the same page.
Sosa caught heat for having his lawyer speak for him. After all, he'd done interviews in English throughout his career. But with stakes this high, I don't really blame him. His lawyer denied that Sosa had ever used illegal steroids,
I have never taken illegal performance-enhancing drugs.
leaving the door open to wonder if he might have purchased and used steroids somewhere they were legal, like in his home country, the Dominican Republic. Then it was Palmero's turn. He'd grown up with Canseco in Miami and was angry that his old friend had named him a steroid user in his book. A few weeks after the hearings, he'd actually test positive. But in front of Congress, he went straight to denial.
I have never used steroids, period. I do not know how to say it any more clearly than that.
Curt Schilling, a longtime critic of steroid users, walked back everything he'd been saying for years.
While I agree it's a problem, I think the issue was grossly overstated by some people, including myself.
And throughout the afternoon, no one was quieter. No one said less with more words than McGuire.
In the year you were breaking the home run record, a bottle of Andro was seen in your locker. How did you get to that point where that was what you were using to prepare yourself to play?
Well, sir, I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to talk about the positive and not the negative about this issue.
Were you ever counseled that precursors or designer steroids might have the same impact?
I'm not here to talk about the past.
As I understand it, both Mr. Schilling, Mr. Thomas, and Mr. Palmero, and I think Mr. Sosa, has said they never used the substances. Now, Mr. McGuire, would you like to comment on that? I didn't get a definitive I didn't hear you say anything about it. And you don't have to, I just asked. You don't want to comment? Are you taking the fifth?
I'm not here to discuss the past. I'm here to be positive about this subject.
McGuire was following Davis's advice, and he looked awful. I remember watching highlights of the hearings, I guess on the local news, and feeling embarrassed. Listening to McGuire's robotic responses, I felt like I'd been tricked. How had I let this man be responsible for my happiness? This man who swore to tell the truth under oath, and then couldn't do any better than I'm not here to talk about the past?
In retrospect, I might have coached him differently. I might have been able to craft something a little different to get the same result instead of the diminution of his career. That was not our intention. Our intention was to change Major League policy.
That sounds totally reasonable. And the league should never have let the situation spin so far out of control. But it did. And Congress was about to get to that.
I'd like to run down a few key provisions of baseball's policy and ask for your professional opinion.
That's Representative Henry Waxman posing a series of questions to Wadler, one of the doctors who testified that day. He's asking about MLB's steroid policy, which league execs had been talking up for months, until the moment Congress asked to actually read it. Then they refused to hand it over, and Davis had to issue a subpoena.
Does the policy cover all anabolic steroids?
No.
Does the policy contain adequate penalties?
Categorically, in my view, not.
And then let me ask you this, will this new policy remove the cloud that has been hanging over baseball?
Unfortunately, I think it increased the cloud.
MLB's policy was a disaster. It didn't test for human growth hormone, and players could test positive 5 times before they were banned for life. They were also allowed to leave the room in the middle of their tests. It's as if the league was inviting them to cheat. And here's the most ridiculous detail of all. First-time offenders had a choice. They could either be suspended and their steroid use would be made public, or they could quietly pay a $10,000 fine and move on without anyone knowing the difference. Baseball said the policy it sent over was just a draft, revising the one it had used the previous year in the first season of testing. Here's Selig being questioned by congressmen, one after the next.
You say nobody came to you, and yet there were articles in the newspaper. What people turning their backs?
I don't believe people were turning their backs. No, I certainly do not believe that. There were very few articles.
Selig, how many people have you suspended?
Well, this policy is just kicked in.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I wish I knew in 1995, 6, 7, and 8 what I know today. Okay. I'll acknowledge that.
I understand, but and I just tell you, this document, for you to send this to us and expect us to use this during this hearing, it's an embarrassment to me, and I would hope that it would be an embarrassment to Major League Baseball.
I'm sitting right behind Bud Selig during the March 17th hearings.
That's Howard Bryant, the writer we talked to last time about Barry Bonds.
Bud would sit under his breath and go, "What about football? What about football? Why are they picking on us? What about football?" And I was like, "Why don't you want to be special?" And I was like, why wouldn't you take the mantle and say, "Yes, we want to be held to a higher standard. We are the national pastime. We don't care about whether football has higher ratings. People come to us for a different reason. And we take that responsibility seriously." And instead, it was like, "What about the other guy?" And that wasn't, that didn't strike me as leadership.
Selig was the only one in the room who might have come off worse than McGuire did. And he was definitely under more pressure than the slugger. Congress was asking him to fundamentally rework his league's drug testing program. Which, to his credit, he did, eventually. MLB's drug program has tightened over the years as a direct result of this intervention. Today, it's one of the most effective in sports. It covers a wide spectrum of PEDs and can trace down to nanogram amounts. And now it takes 3 positive tests for a player to be banned for life, which is a pretty damn good incentive to stay clean. Here's Tom Davis.
We have drastically reduced their use. Not saying it doesn't happen, but the sanctions and the testing regimes are enough that it's greatly reduced it and changed the culture.
The hearings and being so involved, did that change the way you viewed baseball or the extent to which you're a fan?
Well, I'm still a great fan. It just led me to understand the business end of it a lot better.
The hearings had one other concrete result, and it's the one many of us remember most clearly. MLB looked really bad, and it knew it needed to do something to look like it was in control of the situation. So Selig hired former Senator George Mitchell to dig into his league's secrets, to try to draw some conclusion about what had happened and how to move forward. The investigation would eventually yield the Mitchell Report, a 409-page document that I'll talk more about next time. What you need to know now is that it listed 89 players who were believed to have used illegal performance-enhancing drugs. And that's what we remember, that list. But as we've learned, players were only a part of the story.
This was a massive institutional failure. And drugs ruined the sport. It ruined this entire generation.
The report also gave a few recommendations about what the league could have done better and how it could improve its drug program going forward. But Mitchell didn't have subpoena power, so he couldn't force anyone to talk to him. And no one wanted to talk. I know how that feels. My producer and I reached out to more than 70 players, and only 5 of them agreed to participate in this show. You've heard from all of them. Oh, and Bud Selig wouldn't talk either. Almost everyone involved in the steroid era still lives by a code of silence. And the hearings, when players refused to say anything of substance and faced no consequences, they only strengthened the walls around the sport. But they did tell a story. After spending months researching them and interviewing people who were there, I'm sure of that. It was just a much different story from the one Davis imagined. It was about how much power baseball has over us, and how little each of us has over it. Steve Wilstein could write 1,000,000 stories, and Jeff Nowitzki could dig through 1,000 tons of trash. Ken Caminiti could tell secret after secret, but none of that would change much of anything. It took the immovable force of the government to finally put America's pastime in its place. When the Mitchell Report was finally released in 2007, I'd moved past my obsession with McGwire. And it was easy to do. On opening day of Big Mac's final season, a rookie debuted in St. Louis.
A 1-2.
His name was Albert Pujols.
Welcome to St. Louis, Albert Pujols.
He squatted low in the batter's box, narrowed his eyes, stuck out his tongue in concentration, and did unspeakable things to baseballs.
Look at McGwire staring him down. What are you doing in my place here?
He was the best hitter in the game, an MVP candidate nearly every year.
He also has tied a major league record for 8 home runs in the month of April.
The Cardinals started winning 105 games in 2004, the World Series in 2006. And on the day the Mitchell Report was first made public, that's who I worried about. I wasn't expecting to hear the truth from McGwire. Instead, I was terrified I might see Pujols' name. Not because there was any reason to believe he'd been juicing. I was just primed for disappointment, for my favorite sport to let me down again. This time, in this specific case, it didn't. But still, a kind of skepticism took over baseball in the years after the hearings. We became hesitant to believe in anything, anyone. Because what if? What if the sport hadn't cleaned up? What if there was some new lie just waiting to take root? Many fans were left embarrassed or even scared to love baseball. And millions of us did still love it. We were just tired of all the posturing and hand-wringing and lies. We wanted a version of baseball where the truth mattered. Next time on Crushed. How did America's pastime survive the steroid era? And what did we lose along the way?
The long ball used to be cherished. Now people go, was he juicing? That's going to always be in the back of everybody's head, and that's what the steroid era did to baseball.
Crushed is written and reported by me, Joan Neeson. Jessica Popovac is our senior producer. Our associate producer is Devin Manzi, and our production assistant is Megan Coyle. Michael Garofalo is our editor. Jane Ackerman fact-checked the series, and Tommy Bazarian from PRX Productions mixed this episode. Gotham Chopra, Amit Sankaran, and Adam Schlossman are our executive producers. Special thanks to Lisa Pollock and to composer Michael Kramer. Crushed is a production of Religion of Sports and PRX. If you like the show, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you do your listening. On behalf of everyone on the Crushed team and at Religion of Sports, we want to thank sponsors Odoo, Progressive, DraftKings, and BetterHelp Online Counseling for supporting the show and its creators during our launch.
From